The night Clara Whitmore learned the truth, the city of Boston shone like it always did in winter, bright and cold, full of promises that never belonged to her. Gas lamps lined Beacon Street, their yellow light cutting through the thin mist that rolled in from the harbor. Carriages moved slowly over frozen stones, their wheels echoing like distant drums. Inside, one of them sat Clara, her back straight, her hands folded with care in her lap, her face calm enough to fool anyone who looked at her. She had learned years ago how to keep her feelings hidden. In houses filled with power and wealth, silence was often safer than truth. Clara served as the personal companion to Duchess Margaret Hale, widow of the late Duke of Hawthorne. It was not a position that brought attention or praise, but it placed Clara close to a world she never truly belonged to. She organized letters, assisted with visits, and stood quietly at the Duchess's side during social events. She was useful, polite, and invisible when needed. Tonight, however, invisibility felt impossible. The carriage slowed as Hawthorne Manor appeared ahead, its tall windows glowing against the dark sky. Music drifted through the cold air, warm and inviting, carried by violins and soft laughter. This was no ordinary gathering. Tonight was the engagement celebration of Edward Hale, the current Duke of Hawthorne, the man Clara had loved in silence for years. Duchess Margaret rested beside her, eyes half closed from the long ride. She did not notice the shallow rise and fall of Clara's breath, nor the tension in her fingers beneath her gloves. Clara told herself she was prepared. For weeks, whispers had filled drawing rooms and tea parlors. The Duke must marry. His future required it. A suitable match would soon be announced. Clara repeated these facts to herself until they sounded dull and harmless. Still, her heart did not listen. Inside the ballroom, warmth and light wrapped around them. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. The polished floor reflected gowns of silk and satin as guests moved in careful circles. The air smelled of perfume and fresh flowers, layered with wealth and expectation. Clara stayed close to the Duchess, assisting with greetings and gentle reminders. She smiled when required and spoke when spoken to, yet her eyes searched the room without permission, drawn toward the man standing near the far windows. Edward Hale did not command attention with loud gestures or bold words. He stood with quiet control, tall and composed, dressed in dark formal wear that matched his calm presence. His strength was not sharp but steady, the kind that made people feel safe simply by standing near him. Clara felt the familiar ache rise in her chest. Their eyes met across the room. For one brief moment, the noise around them faded. Edward's expression softened, his gaze resting on her as though he had been looking for her without realizing it. Something warm passed between them, something unspoken and fragile. Then someone spoke to him, and the moment ended. Clara looked away. She remembered small things she had never allowed herself to treasure openly. The way Edward once paused beside her in the manor library, asking her opinion on a book. The walks through the garden where he spoke to her as if her thoughts mattered. The quiet smiles exchanged across crowded rooms. She had told herself it meant nothing. As the evening continued, the mood shifted. Guests whispered behind gloved hands. Heads turned toward the main staircase. Anticipation thickened the air. The Duchess leaned toward Clara. "My nephew looks troubled," she said softly. "I fear he dislikes being the center of such attention, though it is his duty." Duty. The word settled heavily inside Clara. When the music slowed, Clara excused herself, claiming she needed to speak with a servant. She needed space, air, something steady. She moved through the crowd, past groups discussing the future Duchess with eager voices. Near the edge of the manor, glass doors led into the conservatory. Soft light glowed inside, and the faint sound of music followed her. Clara hesitated, then stepped in, hoping for a moment alone. She stopped. Edward stood at the center of the conservatory, lantern light casting gentle shadows around him. Across from him stood a young woman in a pale gown, her posture proud, her smile ready. Clara recognized her at once. Eleanor Prescott, daughter of a powerful senator, beautiful, confident, perfectly placed. Clara's breath caught as Edward lowered himself to one knee. The world did not shatter loudly. It went silent. She did not hear his words, but she did not need to. Eleanor's expression bloomed with triumph. She reached for him, her joy clear and certain. Clara stood frozen behind a marble pillar, her body refusing to move. Memories collapsed into one another, each kindness suddenly stripped of hope. She did not cry. She did not gasp. She simply stepped back. Outside, the cold struck her face like a sharp truth. Snow drifted down, soft and slow, settling on her shawl. The sounds of laughter and music spilled from the manor behind her, distant and unreal. Clara lifted her chin. She walked away from Hawthorne Manor without looking back. Before dawn, she left Boston. The city still slept as her carriage moved through fog-covered streets. She took no maid, no large trunks, only what she needed. No explanations were offered. None could be given. The journey north stretched across frozen fields and quiet towns. Clara watched the land change through the window, each mile loosening her ties to the life she had left behind. When she arrived at Whitmore Ridge, her family's estate in northern Maine, snow covered the hills in clean white silence. The house stood firm against the wind, aged but steady, far from the noise of society. Here, no one whispered. Days passed quietly. Clara walked the grounds, read by the fire, and helped the small staff where needed. She did not speak of Boston. She did not speak of Edward. News traveled anyway. In Boston, questions followed her absence. Some said she had fallen ill. Others claimed she had left to care for family. No one spoke the truth because no one knew it. Edward noticed her absence too late. After the engagement announcement, he searched the room without thinking, expecting to find her calm presence nearby. When he did not, a strange hollow feeling settled in his chest. He told himself it meant nothing. Weeks passed. Eleanor planned eagerly, proud of her future. Edward attended events, spoke politely, and fulfilled his role. Yet something inside him felt wrong. His laughter faded. His nights grew quiet and heavy. One evening, alone in his study, Edward opened a book he had borrowed months earlier. A pale blue ribbon slipped from its pages. He held it carefully, memory striking him with sudden force. Clara. Her absence was no longer quiet. It was unbearable. Edward Hale did not understand the silence at first. It crept into his life slowly, settling into corners he had never noticed before. Hawthorne Manor still rang with footsteps and voices. Servants moved as they always had. Guests arrived and departed with practiced smiles, yet something essential was missing, and no one spoke its name. He felt it most in the evenings. The manor seemed larger at night, its halls stretching longer than before. Edward often found himself pausing outside rooms he had no reason to enter, places where Clara had once stood quietly with a letter or a gentle reminder. He told himself this restlessness came from the strain of the engagement, from public expectations pressing too tightly around his life. But the lie did not hold. Eleanor Prescott noticed the change quickly. She was observant, sharp, and unused to being ignored. During dinners, Edward listened politely but answered without warmth. When she spoke of their future home, their social plans, their place in Boston society, he nodded as expected, yet his eyes drifted elsewhere. "You seem distant," Eleanor said one afternoon as they walked through the winter garden. "Surely this should be a joyful time." Edward stopped near a bare rose bush, its branches thin and stripped by the cold. "I am adjusting," he said carefully. "Marriage is not a small matter." She smiled, though there was tension beneath it. "You will adjust quickly. You always do." He did not answer. That night, Edward dreamed of the conservatory. But Clara stood there instead of Eleanor. She looked at him with quiet sadness, and when he reached for her, she stepped back and vanished into the dark. He woke with his heart racing. Across the country, Clara built a life of stillness. Whitmore Ridge was far removed from Boston's expectations. The mornings were sharp with cold, the air clean and honest. Clara rose early, walked the land, and helped oversee the household matters her father had long neglected. She found comfort in simple routines, though her thoughts betrayed her when she least expected it. She avoided mirrors at first. When she finally allowed herself to look, she noticed the change. Her eyes held more depth, her expression calmer but guarded. The countryside had given her distance, not healing. One afternoon, a visiting neighbor mentioned the Duke in passing, speaking lightly of his upcoming wedding. Clara listened without reaction, her hands steady as she poured tea. Only later, alone by the fire, did she feel the weight of the words settle fully. She told herself she had done the right thing. In Boston, rumors began to grow. Edward's mother, Duchess Margaret, watched her son with growing concern. She had known Clara long enough to recognize the quiet influence she held. Without Clara, Edward seemed unanchored. One evening she spoke plainly. "You are not yourself." Edward stared into the fire. "I am what I must be." "No," the Duchess replied. "You are what you have allowed yourself to become." He said nothing, but the words struck deeper than he expected. Days later, Edward found himself standing outside Clara's old room in the manor. It had remained untouched since her departure. Inside, everything was orderly, too orderly. He noticed how little space she had taken in his world, how easily she had made herself small. The realization filled him with shame. That night, Edward asked himself a question he had avoided for months. What if he had been wrong? The answer came quietly but firmly. He ended the engagement 3 days later. The conversation with Eleanor was cold and sharp. She accused him of weakness, of betrayal, of humiliation. Edward listened, apologizing without retreating. He did not offer explanations that would soften the truth. "I cannot marry you," he said simply. "I would be dishonest to us both." The scandal spread quickly, though it was carefully contained. Invitations were withdrawn. Conversations paused when Edward entered rooms. He accepted it all without complaint. For the first time, he felt honest. The next step frightened him more than any social consequence. He needed to find Clara. The journey north was long and quiet. Edward traveled without ceremony, his thoughts replaying moments he had dismissed too easily. Clara's patience, her kindness, the way she had always stood just outside the center of his life, waiting without asking. When he arrived at Whitmore Ridge, the house appeared against the pale sky, like a promise he was unsure he deserved. He knocked. Clara opened the door herself. Time seemed to stop. She looked older, calmer, stronger. Surprise flickered across her face, followed quickly by caution. She did not smile. She did not step aside. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. Edward removed his hat. "Clara," he replied, using her name without thinking. Her father appeared, startled but polite, and invited Edward inside. Clara followed, her posture composed but distant. They stood across from each other in the modest drawing room, the fire crackling softly between them. Edward spoke first, his voice low and unguarded. "I ended the engagement." Clara did not react at once. Then she said quietly, "That changes nothing." "It changes everything," he replied. "I came to tell you what I should have said long ago." She folded her hands. "Please do not mistake regret for love." He met her gaze, unflinching. "I will not insult you by doing so." Silence stretched between them. Edward continued, choosing each word with care. "I thought duty was enough. I believed feeling was something to be managed, not honored. Losing you showed me how wrong I was." Clara turned away slightly, steadying herself. "You did not lose me," she said. "I removed myself." "Because I failed you," he answered. Her voice softened despite herself. "Because I understood my place." "That place was beside me," Edward said, his voice breaking. "I was too blind to claim it." She faced him again, her eyes shining but guarded.
"And if I believe you, what then? Society does not forgive easily."
He stepped closer, careful not to invade her space. "Then let society do its worst. I would rather live honestly than comfortably without you." Clara's breath caught. Outside, the wind moved gently across the hills, carrying the quiet promise of change. Clara did not answer Edward at once. The fire crackled softly, filling the space between them with a warmth that felt almost undeserved after so much cold. She moved toward the window, looking out at the wide fields covered in pale snow. The land was quiet, steady, honest. It had become her refuge. "You speak of honesty now," she said at last, her voice calm but careful. "But honesty comes with consequences. I have lived quietly these months because I chose peace over pain. I will not return to a life where I am made to feel small again." Edward stepped beside her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his presence. "I would never ask you to be small," he said. "I would ask you to be exactly who you are, and to let me stand with you, not above you." She turned to face him. The strength in her expression surprised even herself. Love is not proven by words spoken when regret is sharp. It is proven by what remains when the world pushes back. "I know," Edward replied, "and that is why I am here, not in Boston defending my pride, but here, risking it." Silence returned, but it was no longer empty. Clara searched his face, looking for uncertainty, for the hesitation she had once sensed and feared. What she found instead was resolve, quiet and unyielding. It frightened her, because it stirred the part of her heart she had worked so hard to protect. "I loved you," she said softly. "I loved you without asking for anything, and that love nearly broke me." Edward lowered his head. "I will carry that truth with me always." She studied him a moment longer, then spoke the question that mattered most. "If I walk beside you, I do so as your equal, not as an ornament, not as a convenience. Can you promise me that?" He met her gaze fully. "I promise you my life will be shaped around that truth." Her breath trembled. Days passed slowly after that conversation. Edward did not press her. He stayed at a nearby inn, giving her space to think, to feel, to decide without pressure. Each morning Clara walked the fields, weighing her heart against her fear. She realized something then. Leaving Boston had saved her dignity, but it had not erased her love. It had only forced it into silence. On the fourth evening, she asked him to return. They sat together in the drawing room once more, the fire low and gentle. Clara spoke first. "I cannot promise certainty," she said, "but I can promise truth. That is all I ask," Edward replied. She reached for his hand, her touch steady. "Then I will walk forward with you." Relief passed through him like a breath he had been holding for months. He covered her hand with his, not claiming, only offering. Their return to Boston was quiet and deliberate. The city did not welcome them easily. Whispers followed Clara through drawing rooms once again, sharper this time. Some admired her courage, others questioned her worth. Edward stood beside her through it all, unmoved by opinion. He announced their engagement without spectacle. There were no grand celebrations, no eager crowds, just a simple declaration and a steady hand offered in public without hesitation. On the day they married, the winter sun broke through low clouds, casting soft light over Hawthorne Manor. Clara stood beside Edward, not as a companion, but as his chosen partner. As vows were spoken, the silence of the room felt different than before. It was no longer empty. It was full, and for the first time, neither of them feared it.